Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for joining me again today. I hope you're well. Hope you've had a good week. I thought we'd spend a little bit of time together today in both the Old Testament and the New Testament. We'll take a look first at Jeremiah in the Old Testament, and then we'll shift to Jesus in the New Testament. You know, sometime before 550 BC, the prophet Jeremiah, probably as a late teen, was called by God to be his prophet to the nation of Israel. He was young. He was full of self-doubt that he could ever accomplish what God was asking him to do. But over the next 40 years and during the reign of 5 different kings, Jeremiah kind of chronicled the tumultuous times in which he lived, including messages that God had gave him to give to the people of Israel about Israel's condition and about their future. Jeremiah, he was quite unpopular initially because his prophecies often painted pictures of Israel in a negative way. Because as a nation, they had turned from serving God to serving the pagan gods of the people around them. So I thought we would begin in Jeremiah chapter 17. I'm going to be reading from the English Standard Version today. If you have a Bible and would like to follow along, that would be great. If you have a different version, that's totally fine too. I think we'll be able to track with each other. But we're going to start Jeremiah chapter 17 with verses 7 and 8. This is what Jeremiah writes. Blessed is the man whose trust is in the Lord, whose trust is the Lord. He is like a tree planted by water that sends out its roots by the stream and does not fear when heat comes, for its leaves remain green, and it is not anxious in the year of drought, for it does not cease to bear fruit. Well, did you catch the nuance of what Jeremiah says here? He says, blessed is the man or the woman who trusts in the Lord and whose trust is the Lord. The two are inseparable. There's nothing greater to trust in. There's no one greater to trust in. Jeremiah then uses an analogy of a tree planted by water. The picture is that the tree draws upon the water to get through the drought. You know, Israel would have to draw upon God in the coming years to get through some of the darkest days of their existence when they were in Babylonian captivity. Over 500 years later, Jesus would say something very similar. So we shift now to John chapter 15. We'll look at verses 4 and 5. This is Jesus speaking, and he says this, abide in me, and I in you. As the branch cannot bear fruit by itself unless it abides in the vine, neither can you unless you abide in me. I am the vine, you are the branches. Whoever abides in me and I in him, he it is that bears much fruit. For apart from me, you can do nothing. So abiding with Jesus is akin to Jeremiah's tree planted by the water. As Jesus' followers, he's the vine, we are the branches, and we can't do anything apart from him. It's nearly impossible for us to bear fruit unless we're intimately connected to Jesus. He's the vine that provides everything, the branches, that's us, me, you, we. He provides everything we need. All things life-giving, Jesus provides for us. Now, in his stories, in his parables, in the things that he taught, Jesus frequently used living things as examples. In another instance, Jesus taught the disciples something that seems maybe peculiar on the surface, and that is this. He taught that people are sometimes like trees. So I'm wondering, are you young enough to remember milk wagons? You know, the horse-drawn ones. Well, I can remember those only because we had one of them in our backyard when I was a kid growing up. You know, it had long been decommissioned, and it was tamed by my dad as a storage shed for our lawnmower and our yard tools. You know, we dug a hole in the ground where the lower part of the milk wagon, that part where the milkman would stand as the milk wagon rolled down the street, we sunk that part into the ground with the rest of the milk wagon being flush with our yard. You know, when I was a boy, we had a large, very large apple tree in our backyard. In fact, that apple tree was over 20 feet tall. It had multiple trunks with these wide and thick and gnarled branches. You know something? This tree, this apple tree in our backyard, was never cultivated. It was never pruned, never sprayed. It was never nourished. It was never really cared for. And it grew wild for a long, long time. And as kids, we played in it, we climbed in it, and we swung from its branches. And long before there was cable TV and video games and iPhones, we tied a thick piece of rope to one of the sturdiest branches of that apple tree. And we made a Tarzan swing out of it. What we would do is we would climb on top of that milk wagon with our Tarzan rope in our hand. And then we would fly off the top of that milk wagon, swinging wildly on the rope, hanging from the branch of that old apple tree. And all these years later, that old apple tree reminds me of something Jesus taught in Luke's Gospel. Chapter 6, verse 43, this is what Jesus taught. He said, "For no good tree bears bad fruit, nor again does a bad tree bear good fruit." You know, if a tree is good and healthy, what kind of fruit do you suppose it produces? Well, here Jesus seems to indicate that a good tree will produce good fruit. Now, I'm like you, or you're probably like me, in that I like having a nice piece of fruit, of ripe fruit, maybe a banana, an orange, or occasionally an apple. You know, when I was a boy, our neighbors right next door to us had a pear tree. And man, did that tree produce really good pears. In our neighborhood across the street from our house, a neighbor had a plum tree. And that plum tree produced some of the sweetest plums I've ever tasted in my life. Another neighbor in our neighborhood had a great cherry tree where we were allowed to go and pick cherries. So we, as the neighborhood kids, we got to eat the fruit from all of those trees. You know, if a tree is bad, what kind of fruit do you suppose it will produce? Jesus indicates here that it will probably produce bad fruit. You know, the apple tree, that old big apple tree in my backyard growing up, didn't produce good apples at all. In fact, the apples were very small. They were only a little bit bigger than a golf ball. And they were as gnarled as the tree itself was. Most of them had worms or other kind of insect damage. They fell to the ground where they just rotted. You know, of course, in his teaching, Jesus is using trees and their fruit to describe people. That's how he often taught. Sometimes people got upset with what he was saying because he would paint these word pictures about people, but he would be using other objects to do so. And it would finally dawn on them, hey, he's talking about me. Well, we continue in Luke chapter 6, verse 44, Jesus saying this, "For each tree is known by its own fruit. For figs are not gathered from thorn bushes, nor are grapes picked from a bramble bush." A tree is known by the kind of fruit that it produces. You don't harvest figs from thorn bushes, and you don't harvest grapes from bramble bushes. So what kind of fruit do apple trees produce? Well, that's a silly question, isn't it? We all know that it produces apples. Apple trees don't produce peaches. They produce apples. Now, our old apple tree in our backyard was 20 feet tall, but its apples were terrible. But they were still apples. So apple trees produce apples. I'm wondering, have you ever gone to an apple orchard where you can pick apples on your own? You know, we're just now kind of entering into that season. Fall is almost upon us. Summer is waning. Some of us have done that. We've gone to those apple orchards. In fact, I have several of them within a very short distance of my house where you can go and pick your own apples. But I noticed something about those trees in those apple orchards each time I drive by. Those trees are only about 6 to 7 feet tall, and they're producing terrific apples. I'm not a big apple fan, but I'll eat a Granny Smith apple every now and then. But our 20-foot apple tree didn't produce good apples. These little 6 and 7 foot apple trees are producing great apples. Now remember, Jesus is illustrating that people are like trees in that sense. He continues in Luke chapter 6, verses 45a. This is what he says. "The good person out of the good treasure of his heart produces good, and the evil person out of his evil treasure produces evil." People are like trees. What's on the inside determines what's produced on the outside. What's in our heart determines what kind of fruit you and I will produce with our lives. And here's where Jesus mentioning the vine and the branches is really important, because what we take in will ultimately lodge inside of us, and it's those things that determine the fruit that is produced in our lives. If our heart is good, what kind of things do you think we'll produce? Well, it's kind of simple, isn't it? We'll produce good things. We'll produce those life-giving things. Now, if our heart, on the other hand, is bad, what kind of things do you think we'll produce with our lives? Yeah, we're going to produce bad things, non-life-giving things with our lives. What's in the human heart ultimately shows up in what we do. I really can't hide for very long what's really in my heart. None of us can. That's what Jesus is saying here. You can't hide what's in your heart. It has a way of getting out, regardless of how careful we are to control it. Jesus makes that clear in what he says next. In Luke 6:45b, he says this, "For out of the abundance of the heart, the mouth speaks." Not only do the things inside of us show up in what we do, in our actions, they show up also in what we say and how we say it, whether or not somebody hears it when we say it. To be honest with you, I say some things sometimes to myself that I'd never want anybody to hear. But that's what's inside of me. Our mouth will speak what's really in our hearts. And this takes us all the way back to where we began today with what Jeremiah said. Jeremiah said, "Blessed is the man who trusts in the Lord, whose trust is the Lord. He is like a tree planted by water that sends out its roots by the stream. Whatever we sink our roots into, that's what we're going to draw from. If we seek our roots into the Lord, it's from the Lord that we will draw life-giving and life-sustaining things. If we sink our roots into something else, if we sink our roots into a philosophy, politics, personalities, people, that's what we'll draw from. And it'll lodge in our heart and determine the kind of fruit that you and I produce with our lives. Apart from Jesus, our lives will bear fruit that kind of looks like the fruit from that old apple tree in my backyard as a kid. Gnarled, ugly, old, rotten apples, not good for human consumption. You know, when I read all this and share it with you, my prayer is that we all have sunk our roots into Jesus and are drawing sustenance from him. I was wondering if you would just close with a prayer with me. Let's pray together. Father, so grateful for your word. So grateful for what Jeremiah had to say and what Jesus had to say. And I pray, Lord, that we would draw upon Jesus and draw from Jesus all the things we need for our lives so that we are producing good fruit with our lives. Help us, Lord, to sink our roots deep into Jesus so that we draw from him the very best things that we can possibly produce fruit with. We ask this in Jesus' name. Thank you so much for joining me today. I hope you have a great week. God bless you all. I'll see you again soon.